get help from around the globe to improve at CSGO with Boomeo. Despite what you may have heard, it's not only pussies that do everything to try and win. Well, Fallen will explain to you how to play maps like Inferno. We're talking about the godfather of modern competitive Inferno, breaking down the map and the different positions within strats on it. Shox isn't just going to waste his time telling some pleb like you how to sculpt their hair into a perfect monument to masculine sexuality like he's accomplished. You couldn't do it. But you know what? He could tell you how to run a team in kind of a loose setting and allow your stars to work off what they're best at while having some kind of cohesion like he had in the last G2 lineup, which was able to win ECS and made it to the final of ESL Pro League and played the aforementioned Fallen in an epic 5-game series. You see, when Boomeo send their foreign talent, they do send their best. Now, being as NiKo has just won his first big international tournament, his first big title, there are some key considerations that I think should be outlined as to how we judge the career of NiKo that are incredibly specific to him, but particularly the situation that he's in as someone not playing in his home country or his home region or with people who even speak his native tongue. Now, this is a situation where I could have made similar videos in the past for Simple when he was in Team Liquid, or years and years ago. These are considerations people absolutely should have made for Guardian when he first joined Na'Vi, because the fact that NiKo has won this big international tournament actually means even more that he did it in a team like FaZe and not just with people from his country as with most other people. So this is the reason why I actually think that the same scenario should have applied to Simple when he was in Team Liquid. Now, to me, when Team Liquid made the final of ESL 1 Cologne, one of the majors, with a team of North Americans, and then Simple was the star player playing without people who were from his culture or spoke his language, etc. That makes it an even more impressive accomplishment than some other superstar carrying his team to the final, but they are all from that same background. And you have to consider that, if you're going to be reasonable, and give them a special consideration in that particular respect, and always be mindful of how difficult their circumstances are and how much more they have to overcome to get the same performances inside the server. And so as a result, even though Simple didn't win that tournament, that performance in itself, it goes down as one of the best of all time for my book. It's better than some of the stars who did win majors, depending on what their balance of help was like and what the culture was like and what the era was like for them as players. Now, in this particular instance of NiKo winning the Star Series Season 3 finals, it's not really as key in terms of him winning it. Like, he wasn't the superstar every match of the tournament. In that particular respect, it'd be a lot easier to make this video to point out how much more impressive the accomplishment was if he'd won Katowice, because actually he was incredible in the semi-final against Immortals, pretty much carried that series. He was the main driving force in the final, keeping them close in so many games against the guys from Astralis. If he'd have won that tournament, then it would be like you were the superstar who won the tournament, and now let's look also at all the difficulties. But even so, he was certainly statistically the best player in FaZe. Admittedly, he farmed a lot of it in the group stage, in the Swiss system, but we have to consider all of his accomplishments in the light of these considerations. So first and foremost, he can't be judged according to normal standards. You can't just ignore these considerations and say, right, we'll just judge all players on how they play in the game and what happens in terms of the results. And the reason why is we know that country, culture and language play a big role in Counter-Strike. Sure, you can get certain players, and if you throw them together, mix well, Simple, maybe if they're in the right mix or they're just the right type of player, they can have success anyway. But it's not always the case, and certainly they're at a disadvantage compared to teams which don't even have to consider any of those factors and have people from the same country, with the same culture, speaking the same language, and with the same level of fluency and ability to convey complex ideas and understand nuance within their language and within their culture. And this is a key detail to make. Now, it has already been the case that there have been other players. It's rarely been as significant as it has in the career of NiKo in Mouse Sports and now FaZe. I mean, I said already, Simple during his brief stints in Team Liquid was one example of it. But I think when you look at it, the past, the only player that really compares to NiKo's scenario is probably Guardian, because Guardian was playing in a scenario where he didn't actually understand the language at all. Now, that's more extreme in some sense. Actually, I think in the early days of Na'Vi, Guardian probably deserved these considerations more so than even Simple and NiKo did. But Guardian was able to overcome it by virtue of the fact that, first of all, he doesn't necessarily have some of the more aggressive personality tendencies that some of these other superstars do. Secondly, he stayed in the team for 3 years. So by staying for 3 years, he's become accustomed to the language and to the culture, etc. And he has been able to improve his Russian, etc. And so he's been able to bridge some of these gaps. But that's why, especially in the early days, I never put the same kind of blame on Guardian for his teams not performing as well, or for him not winning the major, for example, as some of the others. Like the fact that Guardian made the major final twice in a row, and playing in a team full of people who speak Russian or Ukrainian, depending on, I mean, obviously they all speak Russian, the common language, but in theory, their home language for the Ukrainians, some of them will be Ukrainian. Now, he doesn't, and that's not his position. Obviously, he comes from Slovakia, so he deserves more consideration for what his accomplishments are worth in the context of what he had to go through. It's not the same as some other superstar finishing second in the final a bunch of times, where we might say about that guy, oh, is that guy a choker or a loser? Because Gardner doesn't have the same opportunities, doesn't have the same advantages they do, and also perhaps, I mean, in case of Guardian, this wasn't the case, doesn't have the same options as to where to go within that region. They might replace him with a player from that region, as you've seen with players like Simple, and, well, I mean, it hasn't happened to NiKo yet, but it could happen in the future. He could also be replaced with someone who they feel is more fluent or understanding of the culture, and so it makes it more difficult to accomplish what they have accomplished. So even in Simple's case, I think Simple's case wasn't as extreme, because at least the other four all did come from the same culture, all did have the same fluency in their native home tongue of English, whereas Simple, yeah, he didn't have very good English. In fact, he had much worse than NiKo, but he just had to do a little bit, and he could be the superstar to some degree. Given autonomy, he can go away and play. In FaZe, they've mostly got pretty good English. We've got a bunch of people from Nordic countries, so obviously they have good English in general, but it's still not the same depth. And when you have to talk quickly, it's still not the same level of complexity sometimes they would get to. And a bunch of them have obviously played in teams in the past, Carrigan particularly, where he's not used to speaking English as much. In most of his career has been speaking Danish with people, and so they're having a switch on the fly. It's not like they've spent their whole career doing it. They haven't got the Guardian effect yet, where you just spend 3 years speaking in that common language, and then that kind of becomes your new world, and you don't have the same disadvantages. Now, one of the reasons why I want to make these considerations clear is because I don't think, when you look at NiKo's level, I don't think anyone has actually ever played as well as NiKo did in 2016 with as little help as he got. And yet, you have to then add in these considerations as well. So the best players in mouse sports were Nex and Chris J. That's it. That's legitimately the best players that NiKo played with during his time in that lineup. So let's look at those players. Nex, yes, someone in 2015 who looked like a rising star, but even with God B, didn't perform at the majors, used to have very up and down performances at tier 1 competitions, and ultimately couldn't be relied upon as a star or a superstar player. And we saw that when NiKo joined the team as well, and he had his issues. And in fact, he became a player whose highs manifested far less frequently and his lows much more frequently. And that's why he's out of the team and he's playing at a lesser level now. Chris J, someone who's never been suited to be a top 2 player in the team. Should always have been a third player. Should always have been like a primary AWPer who you know is a bit streaky, and you ride the streaks because you've got your stars elsewhere and you've got your supportive unit, and that's going to get you through the game, and then he's going to be incredibly impactful. Instead, he was thrust, by the time they got their run to the E-League top 4, he was thrust into being like one of the better players in the team. And as a result, they could only go as far as NiKo and Chris J could carry them pretty much. And even so, Chris J, if you talk about duos, what kind of fair duo was that to have NiKo, one of the best players in the world? Now, if you add Chris J and then you say, right, how does this duo compare to the others? Well, it's nowhere near Shocks and Scream. It's nowhere near Cold Zero and Fallen. It's nowhere near Olaf Meister and Dennis, or whatever era of that Fnatic team you want to talk about. It's nowhere near Guardian and Flamey earlier in the year. These just aren't fair considerations, and yet people were looking at NiKo and comparing him to Guardian and Cold Zero and Olaf Meister and whoever else was at the time the best players in the world, and saying, right, let's just look at how their performances and then let's look at their results, and then their performance doesn't matter unless the results match up as well. And yet we didn't consider these key elements of context that need to be added in. Then you've got to compare that to the fact that the people who've played at the level that NiKo did for most of 2016, they are the greatest players of all time. We're talking about Shocks in very games, and then maybe when he's in G2 last year, where he had Scream on his side, he had RPK with him, he had veteran players at the supporting positions. In the past, he had Existence, the best in-game leader. He had Scream as his wingman then. He had NBK playing a third star role and playing incredibly fantastic half lurk role and a really nuanced game and one of the highest power yet most tactically in-depth teams. Then we had Get Right, obviously at the beginning of the game, had another top 3 player in the world on his team, had players who had a lot of experience in Source and 1.6, had people who at the time fit the game, had the highest salary, had the best conditions. Then you look at Kenny S. Even Kenny S, when he was in his best, which was in Titan, like just before Kaylee got banned and then obviously having to play with RPK fresh off returning, even then Apex was much better than Chris J or Nex were. And beyond that, he had other help. He had people like Maniac was a decent enough support player for the latter 3 to 4 months. Existence was still a good in-game leader who could have a key impact on the game. NiKo had no good in-game leader during his time in Mouse once God B was gone. And God B was dismissed because guess what? He didn't put in the same amount of work and effort and show the same drive to play the game that someone like Existence did, pouring over demos. Never a lack of effort from someone like Existence. You go and look at Olafmeister, that's almost a joke. All the good Fnatic lineups Olafmeister was a part of, he had some of the most help of anyone to ever play the game. Now, yes, he was one of the best players ever, but he also had insanely good surrounding cast. Then you look at Cold Zero. I'd argue Cold Zero also has had some fantastic surrounding cast, especially as you've seen now that FNX left the team and now that Fallen has fallen off in terms of individual play, because now you've seen how good Fur is again, and that this guy maybe could have been doing that all along. Instead, he subjected his game to being lesser, to giving up resources elsewhere, to sacrificing, and yet he was this fantastically talented player playing a lesser role in that respect. And then in the supportive roles, they had players who excelled in their own ways, who were either very stable mentally like FNX, or they could play all sorts of versatile supportive role-playing aspects like Taco. These guys have had so much help. They've had none of the considerations that we're talking about here, like different language, different culture, having to move around from team to team, not having many options as to where they go. They can go anywhere within their social region. These are some problems that someone like NiKo's had that's been incredible. Then you look at the fact, this is an absolute ironclad fact, go look it up. The winners of every single CSGO major, so there have been 10 of them so far, have all 5 members been from the same country. Now, the funny thing is, it could absolutely have happened that wouldn't be the case. Like, there's a couple of examples where that could have happened, and it would have almost been cheating to say, like, yes, technically these players are from different countries, but it doesn't affect the language and the cultural component. So, for example, Very Games were actually the primary favourites to win the first major during Winter 2013, but Existence and Scream are Belgian, and the rest of the team are French. Now, that wouldn't be like, oh, but look, an international team won. No, not really, because culturally they're close enough. Scream and Existence are always played in the French scene, and language-wise, there is no problem whatsoever there. Likewise, on Na'Vi, sure, in terms of Guardian, it's an issue because he's Slovakian. That would have been, I think, a legitimate one in terms of Guardian, but you can't say it in terms of the others in the fact that they had 2 Russian players and 2 Ukrainian players. No, they're not enough of a difference. Those Ukrainian players absolutely understand Russian as a language and speak it very fluently. Some of them as their first language. I'm not sure which one's which. And they absolutely understand the cultural component. There's not enough of a difference in terms of, it's not enough of a clash of like a Bosnian going and playing with a German and someone from the Netherlands. That's too much of a culture clash overall. And so, as I pointed out before, that would have made it more meaningful to me if Guardian had won a major. That would make his accomplishment even more impressive, or at least we'd have to include these considerations when we mentioned that he won the major. Just winning the major and being the superstar, you'd have to say, oh, but he also did it outside of his region and playing it under a different language and in a different culture and had to learn to adapt to those players. This would be bonus points for him in that particular respect. So cultural differences have a huge effect when we're talking about as extreme examples as NiKo has had in Mouse and now, because that's the point I'm making before. You can have countries and cultures which at least share some similarities, but what cultural similarities are there for someone from Bosnia to someone from Denmark and someone from Finland? Now, the cultural differences between people from Denmark and Finland are already fairly large. The cultural differences from someone from Denmark and someone from Bosnia are enormous. Within Europe, you almost couldn't find a bigger gap. I mean, you'd maybe have to go and get a Russian and put him with a Dane and then put him with a French person to find his kind of extreme differences, and yet they've won a massive international tournament together. So clearly cultural differences can have a huge effect. Not least because culture is a shorthand. It is an unwritten language, an operating system that the people within that culture run on. And so as a result, they don't have to say certain things. In terms of, for example, social etiquette, what is polite, what is acceptable to do in this situation, how does one do something here, how do you reply to someone when they say something specific to you, what is the correct response of, how do you apologize to someone, when do you let something go, what was fair to say. All these things we all know, because with our culture we've been programmed and we run on that operating system. And some of us might do a bad job and therefore be considered assholes or not nice people, etc. But in general, we at least all roughly know the rules. If you take someone and you just drop them elsewhere, it's like dropping them into an operating system they've never used before. And they don't actually know what the rules that it's based on are. And they're trying to run programs and subroutines within it that actually don't apply to this operating system. And sometimes they'll short circuit it and won't work entirely. But the people within that operating system, because they themselves are blind necessarily to what's going on, they just think, well, why isn't he doing things the right way? Doesn't he understand this is insulting to me? He's just said something that's totally unacceptable. And they won't even always take the considerations into effect themselves. So this is a really key issue when you consider putting young guys, 19, 20-year-olds, and stars who therefore want to be a big voice and don't just want to sit back and play the game and be the humble. They want to be someone, hey, I need help this way and I've got to do this way. And then they're competitive as well. They're some of the best players. So they're not going to just let a teammate do a mistake and go, oh, well, I don't really know their culture that well. They're going to get it. No, you have to do it this way. I told you not to do that way. Listen to what I'm saying. Or battle someone. That's not the right idea. I think it should be done this way. A lot of simple things like the way you discuss things, the way you argue about things, the way you reply to someone can be taken totally the wrong way, not the way you intended because of the cultural barrier. And that's a big, big deal ultimately. And so cultural barrier becomes like its own language barrier, not least because the cultural barrier is more worrying because in a language, you might not be able to communicate precisely with someone, but you will at least have some understanding of the fact that maybe you're not communicating it correctly. People culturally often won't even take into account that you might not be communicating or intending what you're saying or doing, and they'll just take it as how it's taken within their culture. And so you have an even more kind of powder keg scenario where it can go really, really wrong because there's no shorthand between people from such extremely disparate cultures with no obvious connection between them. So to be able to come and play in a second language and come from Bosnia, a region that has no history of success and excellence, especially not on the level NiKo's accomplishing in CSGO, and then to go and play on first on Mouse Sports, a team which you look at them now and on land, they're not going to do anything special. And then he took them to top 4 at 2 big international tournaments, E-League Season 1 rather, and EPL Season 4. Then he goes over to FaZe, takes them to 2 international finals. This is a team that had never been in an international final before, wins one of those finals. Obviously, he wasn't necessarily as impactful as the event that he lost with them, but wins one of those titles with them as one of the better players within the team, as one of the stars, and a team that had never won before. These considerations before would have been used to prop up why he didn't have the results and to say, listen, you've got to consider these factors. It's not the same as for all the other guys you're contrasting him to in a one-to-one almost like objective manner with no relative context. No, well, now that he's won, we've got to also put in this consideration to say, look at the magnitude of the accomplishment and look at the extra things this guy had to battle through and overcome to be able to get to this point that some of the great players of all time don't always get to when they're in other games. And obviously going forwards, we hope FaZe can be some sort of a threat, some sort of a factor at majors. And so just as with Guardian, making those 2 finals with a team that's totally different culture and language is more impressive, is very impressive and needs special consideration. Let's also apply similar considerations to someone like NiKo.
Yo, this is Alu from FaZe Clan. You got pretty big balls to watch Thorin's YouTube videos.